It's time for a quick hit. This is Midway. I played this recently with my wife. I've played it a number of times in my life, and it's really kind of a favorite of the very light games that I cannot really play solitaire. I don't know how it made it onto the list of games that I'd give the full treatment to, but I want to cover it anyway because I am more comfortable with it at this point. Now, my poor copy, I picked it up used, and I think it only had one sheet. So I've been using these little paper sheets to replace it rather than try to photocopy it or whatever. There may have been more at one point, I don't know, in my copy, obviously the original. So let me explain what you get here and kind of how the game is played and a little bit about it. To begin with, you have this search board, which is going to be, and this is kind of like a game of Battleship. You have this screen up. Now, getting this screen to stand in a way that works is almost impossible. I use a couple of cups on each side or whatever to hold it up. You gotta kind of brace it in place because otherwise these search boards don't work. Another option would be, of course, to cut the search board in half and have it in two pieces, kind of like Bismarck does. But, well, however you have it. And players are going to be moving around on here in their effort to kind of stay hidden while searching out the enemy. And then there's a battle board here where you're going to position ships for both air attacks and also, if you're playing with the advanced rules, which I always do, the tournament rules or whatever, where you can have a possibility of surface combat. Surface combats are pretty rare. And likewise, you have a number of counters. These are ships to be used on the battle board, and then you have ship counters which will be used on the search board to indicate the position of the ships. You got planes which are going to take off and land on carriers or Midway Island. And these are used kind of like change each strength point. You know, a 5 can be broken down into a 3 and a 2 or 5 ones or whatever you need. You have little search markers to remind you where you've searched in a turn, and then also little plaids of little reminders of where an opponent's ships were found. Let's take a little look at the rules. There's really not a lot to this in terms of rules. So at the beginning of the game, the Japanese start on this line, the Americans start on this line, and you start playing right away. You basically can set up your ships divided up into task forces as you like along that line. On the first turn of the game, the Americans are going to get to move 6 squares, and the Japanese will only be allowed to move the normal 2. For the rest of the game, everybody just moves 2, and when you move a ship, you just kind of slide it along. You can move diagonally. You can move, obviously, non-diagonally as well. The search board is broken up into big grid that's referenced through a letter and number to be able to call out sectors like you would in Battleship. And then within that big grid, there's a smaller set of squares to indicate a more specific location. Okay, so after each player moves in a turn, then they can launch searches. And the base default thing is you're allowed to search within 14, no, that's not right, within 12 squares of any of your ships, okay? And that's air search. Basically, there's small reconnaissance planes on board, able to be handled even from non-carrier ships if need be. There are some exceptions to this, however, and there is a big exception, which is Midway, who, if the Americans control Midway, they have the ability to make searches over the whole map. And basically, without Midway, you get 3 air searches. With Midway, you get 4 full map air searches. You also are able to declare a search, and you can mix these in with your searches that are air searches. You don't have to declare it, anywhere where your ships are. So you can make more than the amount of searches you're thought to have available. The problem is, because this board is kind of a mirror image, early in the game, the Japanese know that they can't find the Americans. So they there's no reason to make the air searches. that might give some clue as to where they are, and they certainly don't want to make a surface search. As fleets get close, though, getting those extra surface searches, especially if they're mixed in with your air searches, probably doesn't tell your opponent a hell of a lot. It might tell you, yeah, he's got some ships somewhere within these search regions. So the way a search works is you declare the search. The American player goes first, and he declares all his searches. So you declare something like A1, and then the Japanese player would look over and see if he has any ships in the A1 big box. If he does, he has to report exactly the types of ships, but not their names, and the letter locations that they exist in. So, if you had a carrier over in E and a light cruiser over in I, you would have to announce both of them, and the American could record them. And they become known locations at that point, in the sense that the American can launch an airstrike based on them. They can launch an airstrike at random as well, which is one of the kind of cute things in the game. If you know you're going down, you might want to launch a Hail Mary pass to try to sink a Japanese carrier, which I think is close to what historically happened. Okay. So then after you search, you're allowed to launch your planes in an attack. And this is plotted, you write down your operations here to indicate what you're actually going to launch. And we use just little scraps of paper. I think I've got an example here where I've got time and what's launching. Hey, nothing. Full launch Midway, indicating that all my planes, fighters and bombers, are going. Oh, no, it says half fighters. And, you know, theoretically, you could specify every single plane very carefully, but as long as both players kind of understand what's going on, it's no big deal. And supposedly, you exchange these papers just to verify. Well, I trust, you know. Anyway, in order to launch a strike, planes have a range for launching a strike of 14 hexes. But those 14 hexes include the return trip. So essentially, for a radius, you want to be within, sorry, not hexes, little boxes. You want to be within 7 of these little boxes in order to launch an airstrike. But you can launch an airstrike from one platform and land them somewhere else. The thing is, the carriers have strict limits on the number of planes that they can hold. Actually, everything does. But they're full at the beginning, so this can only hold 21 planes. You can mix up the types as you land new ones on different things. Midway, I believe, has a limit of 30 planes on it, though. So the Americans have this extra base as long as Midway is not destroyed. The airfield's not the island itself, or captured. When you launch the attack, and I'm going to touch the combat rules later, but basically there's first going to be a fighter versus fighter combat, and then the bombers have a chance to land. Now, in the event that you did a search in a square that you have ships, and you find out that your opponent is in exactly the small square that you're in, you have to announce this. You've stumbled into each other and had a surface action. And after any air actions, there'll be a surface battle, and we'll touch on that a little bit. That's a very rare occurrence, though. And obviously, if you're at all familiar with the battle, the Japanese would have a huge advantage if they could bring a surface battle into play, because they have the many more cruisers and even battleships and such not in this. This was a serious undertaking for them, whereas the Americans defended it with 3 carriers. Okay, and no battleships or anything. Okay. There is the worry when you have planes loaded on a carrier, or if you're readying planes, if you have planes that are loaded with bombs and fuel, or if you're in the process of readying planes, which means almost always a carrier has a risk. Now, that risk is that they're destroyed on 1 box less than normal. So, for example, the Soryu here would be destroyed on that 2-box hit. Midway Island itself. Okay, in the basic game, there's one particular cruiser, I believe, the Atago, which comes in somewhere or another. I have the turn sheet, which comes in, I think, down here in the 0500 June 4th turn. And that particular ship is considered to be protecting all the invasion craft. And for that, you have to sail that ship into Midway Island and sit there for 4 turns. And once you do that, you've captured Midway, and you get the victory point bonus for that, which is, I think, it's based on when you take it. You get victory points based on when you take it. If the Americans never lose it, well, if the Japanese take it before the second day ends, I think they get 15 points, and the Americans get 1 point per turn in the third and fourth day? I don't remember. It may be that the Japanese have to take it in the third, before the end of the third day, and the Americans get a point there. I'll see that when we hit the victory points. But okay. That's most of the basic game, except for the dive bombers hitting. But I've kind of weaved the tournament game into here, because fighters are part of the tournament game. I'm going to give you sort of the whole thing on the tournament game, because it's really not that much harder. Within that, for Midway, you're going to have to perform bombing actions or gunfire, naval gunfire, in order to reduce Midway before you can start that invasion process, which makes the game a little tougher. Hey, let's see if I've got the victory conditions here. I bet you I do. Somewhere. How to win. So you get points for ships that you sink. And you get, the U.S. gets 1 point for every June 5th turn. Yeah. So the Japanese gets 15 points for taking Midway before the end of the game. Whereas the U.S. player gets 1 point per turn, starting with the third day, that he holds Midway. And I think that works out to close to 15 points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 16 points. So, if the Japanese take Midway at the very end, it's not really worth anything. But for the most part, this is a game about destroying the enemy ships, because if you can take out the carrier squadron, it's going to be worth a lot more than Midway is. Okay. Let's take a look at how the air combat works, or the air attacks. So, for an air attack on ships, the ships are set up in such a way that they're not adjacent, diagonally or otherwise. There has to be one space in every direction from a ship. Then the attacker is allowed to place his bombers, which will be, say, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, in such a way that the dive bombers are directly over an enemy ship, and the torpedo bombers are adjacent to the broadside of an enemy ship, facing towards it. Now, if I was here, it would be important where the facing is, because this would be attacking the Yamato. Say I do it like this. Now, to determine the actual results, the defender is allowed to allocate his defensive factors, and each ship has 2 numbers on it, a surface combat value, which doesn't matter for this, and an air screening value, which does matter. Now, you're allowed to allocate those within 2 boxes of you. So in this particular case, this ship and this ship could all reach this space, as could this one, and these 2 could reach this space. So, if I wanted to divide up a defense, let's say I sent 5 after this and 10 after this. Then the attack is represented as an odds ratio from the airplane's point of view. So this would be 4 to 10, which would be a 1 to 3 odds, and you roll on here and conduct the number of hits on the ship and the number of damaged plane or destroyed planes. And likewise, this would be a 4 to 5, that would go to 1 to 2. Quite obviously, you'd probably have more planes coming in an attack, but you can see, if you look at the chart a little bit, once you get up to the high odds, your planes have a very good chance of doing a lot of damage to the ships. But low odds attacks tend to be a way to just lose your planes rather than do much damage. And the damage is simply marked off on a sheet. There's no repairs or anything like that in this. Once a ship takes all its hits, it's destroyed. There's an optional rule that if you come within one of being destroyed, you're so damaged you essentially have no value in the game, and you kind of want to try to just hide. For naval surface combat, well, let me skip that for a moment. If you launch, so in the tournament game, if you launch fighters to protect your ships, and the opponent has fighters coming in against you, you get to, as the defender, if you can match the opponent's fighters, you get to roll on the 1-to-1 table. But if you're able to exceed that, well, you could increase your odds, or you could strip, what's usually more often done, you could strip off your additional fighters and add them to your defensive fire, and you can just put them in any space where there are bombers, and they become additional factors for the screening. But you have to have 1-to-1 odds maintained against the enemy fighters to use any of your defensive fighters. Any turn that you launch an attack, your planes are not able to launch an attack the next turn, the ones that flew. They have to be readied on deck. And remember, that still leaves you vulnerable to being attacked. So it's possible you might not want to ready your planes as you try to slip away. Okay. So surface combat, after any air attacks are done in that space, what's going to happen is you essentially, I never see these. You essentially sail onto the board along the edge nearest you, and there's no restriction. You can be next to each other now, and you sail one ship at a time. Let's see. I don't remember what the movement is here. Yeah, it's one rectangle per turn, and then the Japanese gets to fire within range. Battleships have a range of 4 hexes, everything else 3. Odds are comparing surface combat factors, so you'd just be using these. So for example, if we were firing 18-6, that would be a 3-to-1 odds, and you just worry about the hits on the ships themselves. And you're allowed to try to withdraw each turn of battle. On a 5 or a 6, you get your fleets out of the battle. So even if you do trap somebody in a surface combat, chances are they will get away before they get hurt too badly. This is not a game about those big ships. All they do is provide really a screen against the aircraft carriers. And that was kind of a disappointment when I one time did manage to get the Japanese fleet into the US at one point. Midway becomes a little different. Like I said, you have to reduce it. There's this Midway reduction table somewhere where your Midway has a base fortification value of 20, and your bombers or your surface guns will roll against that on an odds table, and you do that much damage to Midway, Midway can't hurt you back, and you also take out the planes that are on Midway equal to that number, which makes Midway a really unsafe place for planes to be. It's a very safe place in the sense that it doesn't sink, but for the most part, the U.S. planes on Midway don't want to be on Midway if you think the Japanese are near there. You want to have something you can attack. At the very least, you want to put your fighter screen over Midway if the opponent hasn't seen you, so that you can shoot him up on his way in. Anyway, once Midway gets reduced, like let's say it starts with a strength of 20, let's say it takes 15 hits, now it has a defensive strength of only 5, which makes it an even weaker place to hit. The anti-aircraft guns, etc. are gone, and it takes much less to remove. Once you reduce it completely, you can start the normal landing process. Victory points. Each ship has a victory point value listed on it. The carriers are quite high. Other ships less so. Of course, the Yamato and Nagato are quite high, the battleships. But again, this is mainly a game about the big carriers. whoever get the most points on between sinking ships and taking out Midway or holding on to Midway just wins the game. All right, I'll come back with some additional words in a moment. Okay, so this is not the most realistic, the most detailed aircraft carrier type game. I understand flat tops a lot better. I've always wanted to get a copy of it, but the simple fact that I very seldomly could get anybody to play this, because, you know, normally I play things solo, and most people didn't want to play the simpler war games. When we got together, we would play something new each time. So maybe I could get somebody to play Midway once, but that would be kind of it. It seemed very unlikely that I'd get lots and lots of games of flat top in. And that kept me from buying it when I was young, and it's kind of kept me from paying the premium prices that it tends to go for nowadays, which is a shame because I would really like to try it. I love this game so much, and I'd like to see a more advanced version of it. In a sense, I've enjoyed Bismarck in the same kind of way, and Jutland, but I just never ended up getting a hold of. I never ended up finding a copy of Flat Top back when used copies were available cheaply everywhere, which is sad. Okay, what about the components? So later editions, I'm sure, had thinner counters, but man, the counter stock on these guys is just beautiful. I bought Jutland new in my era, which is, you know, the late 70s edition of it. And it's got these thin counters, and like Bismarck, it also has this really thin turn gauge little piece of paper thing. And then, you know, I managed to find an old copy for 50 cents or something. And it's got these tremendous counters, and everything's in this kind of, actually maybe even thicker, and the turn gauge and everything is this really solid thing. And it's beautiful to deal with. It's such a shame that Avalon Hill's you know, production quality went down with the raised cost. In some ways, I don't think, you know, maybe the market could have survived a little better components on some of these. But these are just fantastic. The battle board, you know, there's nothing pretty in this game, except maybe the ship counters. The battle board's kind of utilitarian, but I'm a little disturbed by the search board. I always consider cutting this because that works so much better in Bismarck. And just, you know, set up a DM screen or whatever in between them. Anyhow, this has been a really fun game for me every time I've played it. It's got this sort of tension. It's very fast-paced. It may not be a tremendously short game, but we're talking a couple of hours usually. And it's sort of like everything that when you play Battleship, you start saying, wait, what if the ships could move? Wait, what if there was actual, you know, you had to actually engage to fire at each other, or you had to find each other with planes or something. It captures all the essence of the good stuff of Battleship and then puts it into something pretty much believable. You know, this is no detailed simulation, but I would still say it is a war game in the simulation factor, because it really is trying to capture the essence of the situation in a way that, you know, something like Battleship obviously doesn't. And I still have fun. You know, I broke this out with my wife recently, and it was a great time for me. She absolutely hated it. She seems to dislike anything with odds tables, and also, I don't know, just felt like she was working too hard on it somehow. I don't know. To me, it's a very simple game, and I don't understand her complaint about it, to tell you the truth. She said something about it being too complex for how simple it is, which I don't know. Maybe just that there's a decent amount of rules, but basically what the game is about is you've got to find the other player. And it's that kind of trickery, slipping around, trying to hide from their searches. You know where their searches went, you know where their mind kind of is, and you kind of have this ability to react to that. And there's this whole psychological game today. that's what's beautiful about it. But when it comes down to it, actually firing off the planes, I think the complexity of that kind of threw her off. She's used to much more complex games than this, but she just didn't kind of see the point maybe because, I don't know, we had what I thought was an exciting game where I found her early. She could not find me at all. I was playing the Japanese. I managed, she was too far away from me to do anything, but I managed to launch a strike on Midway, drop it down 15 points. And then, neither of us found the other. We both disappeared, and then we found each other at exactly 7 squares range from each other, and both basically launched massive attacks on each other. She had all her carriers together, but had some cruisers loose. I had my entire first force there, and well, I took down 2 carriers right away. So, kind of, the game was over at that point. We played a little bit longer just to make sure that, you know, we weren't giving it an unfair ending there. But I don't know. I'm not sure why she didn't like it. It wasn't because she lost. It was because of this. It's too complex for how simple it is. But I really love this game. And to me, you know, this is sort of the perfect, you know, it says ages 12 and up. This is the perfect game at that age. And it still is very, very good for what it is.